Hello, everybody. It's me again. And what you see there are 11 volumes minus 2 volumes of Will Durant's The Story of Civilization. I have completed it. That was one of my challenges. Let me pan around here. I bet you didn't think you'd hear from me again. The last time we talked was in February when I introduced this new study space to you. I kind of featured it. You remember my little kitchen there. You remember some Barbie. Whoa, that was a little rocky. Some Barbie dolls, my books. Now let me shift over here. This might get hairy. There we go. Whoopsie. Okay, hello. So back again. I'm still trying to read 100 books a year. I'm still trying to read all the books in our home library. And I have completed the big task of reading all 11 volumes of The Story of Civilization. So I'm happy to be here. I hope that you are all well, and I would like to just talk a little bit about the last 2 volumes of Story of Civilization and try to keep it short because I know people are busy, especially you people, and you don't necessarily have time to sit around and listen to me talk about reading history. So, volume 10 was a big, more than 1,000 pages, as I recall, Rousseau and Revolution. I found Jean-Jacques Rousseau to be a very tedious person. It got to be very unpleasant to read about him. Rousseau is a Swiss Calvinist. He, I forget what happened to his mother, but he kind of led a very bohemian youth with his father, just sort of bumming around from place to place. He made a living as a music copyist off and on, in addition to, of course, contributing his ideas, his philosophical ideas. He had a wife of sorts. They finally married in their later years. Her name was Thérèse Levasseur. She was not his intellectual equal, and together they had 5 children, all of whom Rousseau put in an orphanage. So he raised none of the children. He knew none of them. And I think that gives the key to his persona. Selfish man, peevish, narcissistic. Durant calls him the first voice of the Romantic Age. And once Rousseau published his 3 books, Émile, La Nouvelle Heloise, et du Contrat Social in 1762, Durant says that with that, Rousseau owned the age. He, of course, believed that we were born in a state of nature. Man was good, that what corrupted us were social institutions like the family, marriage, governance, schools, the church, and that if we could just be left to our own devices, we would proceed happily through the world and do all kinds of good things. He also believed in the equal ability of everyone, that all of us were capable of achieving to the same, I guess, high level, like as he did. And but again, there seemed to be nothing really much substance about him. I didn't think, and his ideas were really not even embraced by the masses. So it kind of made me think back to that book called 3 Reformers, which I referred to in one video. 3 Reformers it was a book by Jacques Maritain, and the 3 Reformers are Martin Luther, René Descartes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Maritain says as an introduction that most of the modern evils that we encounter or visited upon us by these 3 reformers. And I think after reading about Rousseau, that was certainly the case. And you wonder how do these negative ideas, talking about the uselessness of marriage, the corruption, how family corrupts, how do these bad ideas percolate through history? And I quote Alice von Hildebrand here. She is the she's an intellect in her own right, but she's the wife of Dietrich von Hildebrand, a German philosopher. She said, well, diseases are communicable. Many diseases are highly communicable, but good health is less communicable or is not communicable. I think that's kind of what happens. We sometimes allow these, we allow these ideas that appeal to the worst in our nature to proliferate. So that's Rousseau. On to volume 11. Volume 11, The Age of Napoleon, took us from 1789 to 1850. I discovered that I knew very little about the French Revolution, and I knew less about Napoleon. Now, I will say that I had the opportunity in between reading these books to do other reading, and I read a biography of Alexander the Great. I must say, after reading about Alexander the Great, Napoleon paled somewhat in comparison. But he did conquer all of Europe, only to lose it, but still we must acknowledge his place in history. So there was a lot to be learned in volume 11. I will confess to skimming through parts of volume 11. I do have a mechanism for skimming. I don't just go willy-nilly haphazard, but there were, Durant covered a lot of literature, arts, and the culture of that age. So, for example, he had a lengthy section on the lake poets. That's Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey. And I felt they were, I just couldn't take it after a while. And I have studied some of their poetry. But, you know, they have these patrons, and they set them up in a beautiful cottage here, and then a gorgeous villa there, and then they travel all around. And there was always somebody's sister who adored her brother, and she had to be along, and then she'd find somebody in the group she'd marry, and then honestly, they became so tiresome. So I had to skim that section. It was the same with Byron, Shelley, and a lengthy section on German philosophers. So despite the fact that I skimmed, I really do think that I completed my task of covering really 5,000 years almost of history in Durant's very seminal work, The Story of Civilization. So I'd like to address a couple lighter topics. Again, I don't want to keep everyone too long, but you know, it's kind of fun. One of you asked if I always eat cupcakes after I make one of my history videos. And the reason that Charla asked that was because going back to one of the early videos, I explained to you the importance of making timelines in the study of history and how I made these timelines, and they help me study and memorize dates. And I said that I use these cupcake carriers. Remember these? I fold these flaps down, and then this goes like this. It's kind of hard to reconstruct because I've had to style these carriers. But these are the cupcake carriers that Charla was recalling, and they come from the Silos Bakery in Waco, Texas, you know, which is the brainchild of Chip and Joanna Gaines. So I have plenty of these carriers. No, I do not always eat cupcakes, but I am have found it interesting that I rely less and less on the timelines. Why is that? Well, I think that after enough reading, autodidact that I am, like George Washington, he was also an autodidact, I found that I need the timeline less and less. And that's because I think I've memorized certain dates that serve as benchmarks around which I can fit other new events and to place them in their proper chronology and history. So for example, I like to remember 323 BC, that was the death of Alexander the Great. 324 AD is when Constantine became the sole emperor of Rome. 1054, the Great Schism. 1450, roughly, printing press. Then there's a date I always like. At 1492, I think of as the modern era, the beginning of the modern era. Then I like to always remember, for some reason, 1564. That's the year that Michelangelo died and that Galileo was born. And they represent kind of the transition, the verge, between the Renaissance and then the Age of Reason. So I think that has been, I wanted to mention that. And so you can see what timelines can do for you. And then a little shout out to Rebecca. We were talking about English kings and queens, and she told me, well, why don't you consult your timeline? And I said, well, I will, but even better for the dynasties, we like to say, of the Brits, I found this wonderful book that if you have a question about any king or queen, like say Edward III, boom, look it up in the index, and then it sends you, and you discover that he was one of the Plantagenets, and then you go back and read all about it, all organized in this one handy reference book. So I found this at a library sale for $2. I really like that. And that can work well, too, as a study aid. And I see we're at our 10-minute mark. So the last thing I want to mention is maps. You might remember reading history, importance of maps. I put my maps into this handy folder. I just want to tell you that when I read Alexander the Great's, the biography, I went back to these maps I had made of Greece. I think I must have made these 10 years ago. Timeless history, timeless aids to studying history. So that's about it. Very happy to be with you. I hope everyone is well. And I hope to be back in 2 weeks. And the topic I would like to address is vintage books. I thought that might be interesting. So thanks so much, and see you next time.